so the tricky issue there, I think, is that people who are taking themselves apart, they're often conscientious people. And so, well, they'll assume that taking ownership in your terms means raking yourself over the coals. And the crucial thing to establish there is like, well, yeah, you have to rake yourself over the coals until you learn, but no more than that, because after that it's counterproductive. Is what you're trying to foster is improvement, right? Now, and then in terms of making a case for your innocence, that's where analysis of ignorance is useful. You know, you said, well, and it's a question of conscience. Did you make the best use of the information that you had available at the time? And one answer is, well, yes, but I had sparse information. And then you have to ask yourself, well, could have you been more informed if your eyes would have been more open? That's a willful blindness issue. But it's definitely worthwhile to, when you're making a case to defend yourself, to see how much of the sequence of events that resulted in the unfortunate conclusion was attributable to situation. There's a classic mistake in thinking that people make called the fundamental attribution error. So imagine that you're driving along on the road and somebody cuts you off and you say, well, that son of a bitch. It's like, and then, you know, you find 2 blocks later that you're in the same situation in terms of the positioning of the automobiles, and you cut someone else off. And it's harder to do a situational analysis than to do a personal attribution. And so people will default to a personal attribution, that son of a bitch. And that can turn around to bite you, because it's difficult when you're retroactively assessing something you've done to take into account all the situational factors. But that is definitely something you do if you're mounting a defense for yourself. And that's part of that presumption of innocence. So we could say, if you're trying to get yourself out of something like post-traumatic stress disorder, we would say, well, how would you make the case for yourself if you began with the presumption of innocence and that there were situational factors? Make the strongest possible case. So you do that. Now, if there's some residual issues that you have to contend with, like the fact that you were willfully blind, or, you know, maybe you weren't protecting your men, maybe you were going for the promotion because you're more ambitious than you should be, like that speaks to intent. But you shouldn't convict yourself until all the arguments that are in favor of your innocence have exhausted themselves, right? And that is the way that our legal system is set up, and there's a good reason for that too. And then knowing also that atonement is possible and forgiveness appropriate when you've learned your lesson, you know, and that's also very useful when you're disciplining children. So, for example, when my kids were young and I used to have them sit on the steps when they were, you know, acting like barbarians, I should clarify that. You discipline your children when they're acting in a way that isn't appropriate for their age, in accordance with universal human judgment. So you should discipline your children when they're disgracing themselves. And the reason you should do that isn't because they're bad kids, or because it reflects badly on you, or because you're angry, but because if they continue to act that way, other people aren't going to want to have them around. And that's not good for your kids, so you discipline them. So I say to my son, for example, go sit on the steps till you can act like a civilized human being, or whatever terminology is appropriate when he's young. And the rule was, well, as soon as you get yourself under control, problem solved. Well, it's the same with past sins, so to speak, as if you failed to hit the target properly, but you figured out why, and now you know how you would chart your course differently in the future, done. You know, and it's also the case that even most negative emotion that you experience in relationship to past memories only emerges because there's a hole in your adaptive structure. So imagine at some point in the past you fell in a pit and you don't know how you got there. Well, that emotion is going to remain hot and dangerous until you figure out why you fell in. And the reason that your conscience keeps torturing you about that is because, well, you fell into a hole and you don't know why, and so maybe you'll fall into another one, and so you shouldn't be that comfortable. But if you can figure out why, and you can reevaluate your aim or your course so that that isn't going to happen in the future. Well, even psychologically, your own conscience will let you off the hook if you've reconfigured your pathway. And you do that, well, partly by not taking yourself apart to any great degree. All right, so you said that one of the things that you said there were two reasons you thought that people were maybe coming to see you live, is they'd been watching your podcast and they actually wanted to make more personal contact. Do you do meet and greets and that sort of thing at the end of the?
I do it the whole time. Like, as soon as people start coming in, I just hang out with them and then get up on stage and do the show and then hang out. And the staff at the place will say, how long are you gonna meet with people? And I say, until everyone's met with me that wants to.
Oh yeah, and do you do that, do you do that formally or do you do that informally?
Informally.
Informally. Yep. See, at the end of my lectures, we have a formal meet and greet and people line up, and there's a bunch of reasons for doing that. There's a ticket increment that's associated with that. So there's a financial reason, and that makes the tour more rewarding. But it's also because there's so many people that want to do that, formalizing it made it much more efficient. You know, because everybody gets, it's not very much time. It's only about 15 seconds, probably something like that. But the parameters are pretty nicely defined, and we can, what would we say? We can provide more people with what they want doing that. And so I really enjoy that, actually. And you know, 15 seconds isn't very long, but it's not nothing. And if you're awake, you can have a bit of an interaction with someone that isn't only surface. And that's also a really interesting challenge, you know, to be able to do that rapidly and efficiently in a way that's satisfying for everybody who's involved.
Yeah. Well, the weird thing is people come up to me and they say, I feel like I know you.
Yeah, right.
And I say, you do.
Yeah.
Like, you listen to the podcast, there's hundreds and hundreds of hours of me talking about all this different stuff. And if you listen to all that, you do know.
Yeah, right.
And then I kind of know you too, because we've had these shared experiences of going through all these topics together. And so I kind of know you too.
Yeah.
And so you do have like a legitimate connection with people, and that they can come up and just tell you whatever it is they're going to tell you.
Yeah.
And they can ask me a question in 14 seconds and I'll give them an answer in 32 seconds and we're good. And they're high-fiving and bro hug and we're moving on. It's
well, that's a lot of
awesome
contextual information.
Yeah.
Absolutely, I feel exactly the same way.
Yeah.